Killing someone is already illegal. That's like the first rule of every civilization ever. But in war, killing is literally the job. So where exactly is the line? That's what makes this category so uncomfortable and why it exists in the first place. Today, we're walking through every type of war crime, all 16 of them. Not a lecture, just what they actually mean and why they matter. Starting with the most basic one, willful killing. This is the most fundamental war crime there is, and on the surface, it sounds redundant. Murder is already a crime. But here's the thing, in combat, killing an enemy soldier is completely legal. The moment that soldier surrenders, gets wounded, or gets captured, killing them becomes a war crime. That's the line. It's not about killing, it's about killing someone who's protected. And the enforcement barely exists. During the My Lai massacre, US soldiers killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians. Hundreds. Only one person was convicted, Lieutenant William Calley, and he served 3.5 years of house arrest. Not prison, house arrest. Then there's Srebrenica in 1995, where Bosnian Serb forces executed between 7,000 and 8,000 Muslim men and boys in a UN-designated safe area in a matter of days. So yeah, the rules exist, but as you're about to see with every single category on this list, enforcing them is a completely different story. Torture and inhuman treatment. Here's what the law says about torture. There are 0 exceptions. No ticking time bomb scenario. No national security carve-out. No, I was just following orders. The Convention Against Torture says this explicitly. No exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war, a threat of war, or any public emergency, may be invoked as justification. Period. And then Abu Ghraib happened. In 2004, photos leaked showing US soldiers forcing detainees into stress positions, unleashing military dogs on prisoners, using sleep deprivation, beating them, and subjecting them to sexual humiliation. All of it authorized in writing by senior officials, including Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld himself. They didn't even try to hide it internally. They put it in memos. And separately, the CIA was waterboarding detainees at black sites and Guantanamo Bay, another program approved at the highest levels. But here's where it gets enraging. Soldiers like Lindy England got 3 years in prison. The officials who signed those memos authorizing every single one of those techniques, 0 criminal charges, not one, and that term enhanced interrogation? That wasn't a new category of questioning. That was a legal rebranding strategy designed to avoid the word torture. The acts themselves met the definition of torture under international law. Calling it something different didn't change what it was. The gap between what the law says and what actually happened is the whole story here. The law says no exceptions, ever. Reality says the people at the bottom get punished and the people at the top walk free. But torture is honestly tame compared to what comes next. Sexual violence. This is the one nobody wanted to prosecute for most of human history. Rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization. The Rome Statute lists every single one explicitly as a war crime. But here's what makes this category uniquely horrifying. When used to destroy an ethnic group, it's not just a war crime. It's genocide. And that legal distinction didn't exist until 1998. The Akayesu ruling was the first time an international court declared that rape could constitute an act of genocide. This came after Rwanda, where an estimated 500,000 women were raped over roughly 100 days. In Bosnia, Serbian forces used rape systematically as a weapon of terror against Bosniak women and girls. Estimates range from 20,000 to 50,000 victims. Detention camps were established specifically for this purpose. Forced pregnancy gets its own legal definition: unlawfully confining a woman who has been forcibly impregnated with the intent to affect ethnic composition. And this is not history. In 2025, the UN reported that all parties in the DRC conflict are systematically using sexual violence as a tactic of war right now. But if you think the physical crimes are the only ones that count, wait until you see what the law says about hostages. Taking of hostages. This one is straightforward, and that's what makes it so disturbing. Taking hostages isn't just kidnapping. It's seizing people and threatening to harm or kill them unless a third party meets your demands. You're turning human beings into bargaining chips, and that is explicitly banned under Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions and the Fourth Geneva Convention. No exceptions. No military necessity loophole. None. The key element here is the coercive threat. Detaining someone during a conflict can be lawful under certain circumstances, but the moment you say, "Do what we want or these people suffer," you've committed a war crime. Full stop, and we don't have to look far back for an example. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas took roughly 250 hostages from Israel, explicitly stating they would not release them until Israel ended its bombardment of Gaza and freed Palestinian prisoners. The hostages included children, elderly people, individuals with disabilities, and foreign nationals from Mexico, the United States, and Germany. Human Rights Watch formally classified this as a war crime. There is zero ambiguity in the law here. Using human beings as leverage is categorically prohibited, regardless of the strategic situation, regardless of what the other side is doing, regardless of anything. People are not negotiating tools. But if hostage-taking sounds like one of the more personal war crimes, wait until we get into one that targets entire populations at once. Attacking civilians. The entire legal architecture of war rests on one single principle. Combatants are fair game, civilians are not. When that line gets crossed, everything else in international humanitarian law falls apart, and this war crime is exactly what happens when someone ignores it. Now, intentional targeting is the obvious case. You aim at civilians on purpose, that's a war crime, end of story. But here's where it gets more complicated. Indiscriminate attacks, ones that make zero effort to distinguish between military and civilian targets, also qualify. You don't get to shrug and say you weren't aiming at anyone specific. Then there's proportionality, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Even if you're striking a legitimate military target, if the expected civilian deaths are excessive compared to the military advantage you'd gain, that's a war crime. Commanders are legally required to make that calculation before every single strike. It's not optional math, and when there's genuine doubt about whether someone is a civilian or a combatant, international law says you treat them as a civilian. No exceptions. Modern conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, and the DRC have all generated documented investigations into systematic civilian targeting by both state and non-state actors. Nobody gets a pass on this one, and yet it keeps happening at scale. But attacking people is one thing. What about stealing everything they own? Pillaging. Most people hear the word looting in a war context and think of it as some unavoidable side effect. Soldiers grab stuff, things go missing, war is chaos. But here's the thing, pillaging isn't a side effect, it's a weapon. Under both the Rome Statute and customary international law, taking civilian property by force during conflict or occupation is a straight-up war crime. And the legal line is actually pretty clear. If a military seizes supplies it genuinely needs for immediate operations, that can be lawful requisition. The moment you're taking stuff for personal profit or deliberately destroying civilian livelihoods, that's pillaging. And it's not just some technicality sitting in a dusty law book. Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, was indicted by the ICRC partly because he ordered the systematic pillaging of villages and camps across Darfur. The Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda was accused of looting civilian settlements over and over again as part of a broader terror campaign designed to break entire communities. That's the part people miss. Pillaging isn't petty theft. It's economic warfare. You strip civilians of everything they need to survive. Food, tools, shelter, livestock, and you control them completely. No bullets required. But if stripping people of their possessions sounds cruel, wait until you hear about a war crime that strips them of something far worse. Using child soldiers. Here's something that should make zero sense. The international community has spent over 35 years building legal frameworks to protect children from armed conflict. The Rome Statute made it a war crime to recruit or use anyone under 15 in hostilities. The optional protocol pushed that protection to all children under 18. And yet, from 2024 onward, child recruitment by armed groups actually increased. Let that sink in. More laws, more international attention, more commitments, and the problem got worse. This isn't happening in one or two places. Colombia, the DRC, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Haiti, Mozambique, the Sahel. This is a global crisis hiding in plain sight. But if you want to understand just how dark this gets, look at the Lord's Resistance Army under Joseph Kony. Nearly every single member of the LRA, except a handful of senior officers, was forcibly abducted. Children were beaten into submission, sometimes forced to commit atrocities against other captives to destroy any sense of identity or resistance. Girls were taken as bushwives. The LRA committed all 6 grave violations the UN Security Council designates against children simultaneously. Every single one. And the horror doesn't end when the fighting stops. Children who escape face brutal stigma from their own communities. The psychological trauma is devastating, and girls returning home with children born of sexual abuse face rejection from the very families they were stolen from. The crime isn't just the recruitment, it's everything that follows. But if you think exploiting children is the lowest this list goes, wait until you see what happens when entire populations are forcibly ripped from their homes. Unlawful deportation. Forcibly moving civilians out of their homes or unlawfully imprisoning them is a war crime. When it's done systematically, it also qualifies as a crime against humanity. Now, there is a narrow legal exception. Evacuation is permitted if civilians are in immediate danger or there's an imperative military reason. But the bar is extremely high, and the displacement must be temporary. Here's what actually happens in practice. In March 1995, Radovan Karadzic issued Directive 7, explicitly ordering Bosnian Serb forces to make conditions in the Srebrenica enclave so unbearable that survival was impossible. That's not an evacuation. That's engineered despair. Approximately 30,000 women, children, and elderly were then forcibly transferred out. The 8,000 men and boys left behind were executed. Both the ICTY and the International Court of Justice ruled that the forcible transfer at Srebrenica was a component of genocide, and this isn't history. In the DRC right now, 7.8 million people are internally displaced and 1.1 million have fled to neighboring countries. Children make up over half that refugee population. But if forced displacement is devastating, wait until you see what happens when armies deliberately target the places civilians run to for safety. Attacking protected sites. Most people assume that hospitals, schools, and religious buildings have absolute protection during war. They don't. And that distinction is where things get legally fascinating. Under international humanitarian law, hospitals, schools, places of worship, and cultural monuments all carry protected status. Deliberately attacking them is a war crime, but a hospital loses that protection if it's being used to store weapons or function as a military command post. Even then, you can't just bomb it. A warning must be issued first, and the wounded inside must still be protected. Then, there's the cultural heritage question. In 1993, Croatian forces deliberately destroyed the Stari Most Bridge in Mostar, built in 1566. Here's the thing. The bridge actually had some military utility for resupply, but the ICTY appeals chamber ultimately ruled that while it was a legitimate military target, the convictions that stuck were for persecution as a crime against humanity, recognizing the devastating impact on the civilian population's cultural identity. A target can be technically military and still form the basis of a war crime through a different legal door. That's the dual-use problem in a nutshell. And if you think buildings are complicated, wait until we talk about what happens when you strip away every legal protection a prisoner is supposed to have. Denying a fair trial. Here's one that doesn't involve explosions or body counts, but it's still a war crime. Every person detained during armed conflict has the right to a fair trial. POWs, civilians in occupied territory, security detainees, all of them. And fair has a specific meaning. You have to be told what you're charged with. You get time to prepare a defense, you get a lawyer, you face an independent tribunal, you can examine witnesses, you can appeal. Remove any of those, and the trial isn't legitimate. But here's the part. Most people get wrong. Prisoners of war cannot be prosecuted for fighting. That's the whole point. Being a soldier in a war is not a crime. If a POW is accused of a war crime, absolutely, they get a trial. But you can't charge someone just for being on the other side. Even unlawful combatants and people accused of terrorism still get these protections. The crime isn't a paperwork mistake or a procedural hiccup. It's the deliberate, willful stripping of someone's right to a legitimate legal process. And that distinction matters, because without it, detention just becomes disappearance with extra steps. But if you think courtroom violations sound tame, wait until we get to a war crime that weaponizes the one thing every human being needs to survive. Using human shields. This one creates a legal nightmare that almost nobody understands. Intentionally placing civilians around military targets, whether those civilians are there voluntarily or not, is a war crime. You're literally using human lives as armor. But here's where it gets complicated. The presence of human shields does not make the military target immune from attack. The attacking force still has to do a proportionality calculation before striking, but the party that put the civilians there bears criminal responsibility for their presence. See the trap? Both sides can be held liable simultaneously. The attacker for disproportionate civilian casualties, and the shielder for creating the situation in the first place. This has been a central allegation in multiple conflicts. During the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, investigations examined whether Hezbollah deliberately positioned military assets near civilian populations. Similar allegations have been investigated in the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict regarding civilian infrastructure proximity to military objectives. But the key legal question is intent. Was the civilian presence deliberately designed to shield military operations, or were civilians simply nearby because that's where they live? That distinction requires detailed factual investigation and is fiercely contested in almost every case, and that ambiguity is exactly what makes human shielding so effective and so difficult to prosecute. But using civilians as cover is one thing. What about cutting off their food entirely? Starvation as a weapon. Here's one that's happening right now in multiple conflicts, and almost nobody gets charged for it. Deliberately starving a civilian population as a method of warfare is a war crime. That means destroying food supplies, blocking aid convoys, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, poisoning water sources, or making agricultural land completely unusable. All of it is prohibited. But here's the thing. Wars cause famine all the time. Fighting disrupts supply chains, destroys infrastructure, displaces farmers. Starvation as a byproduct of conflict is not automatically this crime. Prosecutors have to prove something much harder, that the starvation was the point, not a consequence, not collateral damage, the strategy. That intent requirement is what makes this one of the hardest war crimes to prosecute, despite widespread documentation of its effects. You can have an entire population visibly starving, aid trucks sitting at checkpoints for weeks, farmland deliberately razed, and still not secure a conviction if you can't prove the conscious objective was to deny civilians food for its survival value. How do you prove what someone intended when they can just claim military necessity? And that's exactly why this crime keeps happening. The legal bar is high enough that perpetrators can hide behind plausible deniability while millions go hungry. But if you think proving intent is difficult for starvation, wait until you see the war crime, where the weapon is literally invisible. Biological and chemical weapons. These weapons are banned under so many overlapping treaties, it's almost comical. The 1925 Geneva Protocol, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, the Rome Statute. The international community has said stop this in every possible way. And yet, on August 21st, 2013, sarin gas rained down on eastern and western Ghouta in Syria. Over 1,000 civilians died. The investigation traced the chain of command directly to President Bashar al-Assad and his brother Maher, who personally ordered the strikes. The international community responded by forcing Syria to declare and destroy its entire chemical weapons stockpile, with 96% of declared materials destroyed by September 2014 under full international supervision. Problem solved, right? Then in April 2017, Assad hit Khan Sheikhoun with chemical weapons again. The stockpile destruction meant nothing. The program had never been fully disclosed. They lied, destroyed what they were willing to lose, and kept going. But Syria is recent history. Go back to World War II and you find something arguably worse. Japan's Unit 731 tested at least 25 different disease-causing agents on live prisoners. They poisoned over 1,000 water wells in Chinese villages just to study cholera and typhus outbreaks in real populations. The facility had around 3,000 staff members and held up to 600 prisoners at any given time, cycling through them constantly as subjects died from human experimentation. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was industrial-scale biological warfare research. And the Soviet Union, they signed the Biological Weapons Convention, then secretly maintained an entire offensive bioweapons program called Biopreparat. In 1979, an anthrax leak at a facility in Sverdlovsk killed between 65 and 100 people, a treaty violation that literally killed civilians on their own soil. But if chemical and biological weapons represent humanity's darkest arsenal, the next entry proves you don't need any weapons at all to commit a war crime: attacking humanitarian workers. These people carry no weapons. They wear vests marked with crosses and crescents. They drive clearly labeled vehicles into the worst places on Earth to save lives. And they're being slaughtered at a rate never seen before in human history. A 2025 UN report put it bluntly: the killing of humanitarian workers has reached record heights, and impunity for these attacks is now the new normal. Not an outlier, not a crisis. The normal. The numbers are staggering. In Gaza, 399 humanitarian personnel have been killed, including 289 UN staff. 8 Red Crescent medics were found in a mass grave in Rafah, still wearing their protective gear. Let that sink in. They were in uniform. They were identifiable. They were killed anyway. In Sudan, more than 100 aid workers have been killed since April 2023. Ukraine has lost 23. The DRC has seen numerous attacks on humanitarian personnel. But here's where it gets truly evil. Russian forces in Ukraine have repeatedly carried out what are called double tap strikes. They hit a location, wait for first responders to arrive to treat the wounded, then hit the exact same spot again. They are literally weaponizing the humanitarian instinct itself. The people running toward danger to save lives become the second target. Under international law, command responsibility applies here. Military commanders can be held criminally liable if they knew or should have known their subordinates were attacking humanitarian workers and did nothing to stop or punish it. And yet, accountability remains almost non-existent, which is exactly why the UN called impunity the new normal. Nobody's paying the price, so nobody stops. If you think targeting aid workers is as low as it gets, wait until we talk about something even more personal: outrages upon personal dignity. Most war crimes require a victim who's alive to suffer. This one doesn't. Outrages upon personal dignity cover any act that humiliates, degrades, or violates the dignity of a protected person, even when zero physical injury results. Forcing someone to perform degrading acts, publicly humiliating prisoners, stripping them of every shred of humanity. All of it qualifies. But here's the part that genuinely surprises people. This crime also applies to the dead. Under the Rome Statute, the victim does not need to be personally aware of the violation for it to count. A corpse can be the victim of a war crime. Mistreating, desecrating, or humiliating a dead body during armed conflict is its own prosecutable offense. And this isn't some modern invention. Post-World War II tribunals in the Pacific Theater explicitly prosecuted desecration of the dead. The 1947 Pohl case at Nuremberg declared that desecration of the dead, even without the added offense of killing, is and always has been a crime. August Frank was convicted for plundering concentration camp dead for valuables, pulling gold teeth, stripping belongings off corpses, all war crimes. The most recognizable modern example ties back to Abu Ghraib. After Manadel al-Jamadi died under torture, photographs showed soldiers posing with and desecrating his corpse. Combined with the sexual humiliation and forced degrading acts inflicted on living prisoners, those images contributed directly to war crimes convictions. The ICRC defines the prohibited conduct as acts aimed at humiliating and ridiculing persons, even forcing them to perform degrading acts. The legal test isn't whether the victim felt humiliated, it's whether the conduct was severe enough that any reasonable person would recognize it as an outrage upon dignity, living or dead. But if degrading someone's dignity is a war crime, wait until you hear about the one that makes it a crime to simply announce your intentions: declaring no quarter. This is the one almost nobody knows about, and it might be the most counterintuitive war crime on this entire list, because the crime isn't killing someone, it's saying you're going to. Declaring no quarter means announcing to the enemy that you will not take prisoners, that anyone who surrenders will be killed anyway. And here's the thing, that declaration alone regardless of whether you actually carry it out, is a prosecutable war crime under the Rome Statute and Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. The words themselves are the violation. Combatants have a legal right to surrender. Once they lay down their arms and show they can no longer resist, they must be treated as prisoners of war with full humanitarian protections. Declaring no quarter is a pre-announcement that this right will be ignored. But the prohibition isn't just about morality, it's about strategy. Think about it. If soldiers know that surrendering means death, they have zero reason to stop fighting. Every battle becomes a fight to the last man. Casualties skyrocket on both sides. Conflicts drag on longer than they ever needed to. The declaration removes the only off-ramp warfare has left. And psychologically, it does something even worse. It tells your own troops that humanitarian restraint is off the table, which means violence escalates well beyond what the declaration even covered. Most people hear no quarter and think it's just a dramatic battlefield threat. It's not. It's a crime, and that's 16 categories of war crimes. These are not abstract legal concepts sitting in old textbooks. Every single one of them has been documented in living memory. Many of them are happening in conflicts that are still ongoing right now. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.